I've been reviewing these 50 multiple-choice questions for the Mao Zedong Thought and Socialism with Chinese Characteristics course. Many of them touch on core concepts and historical turning points. Let's walk through some key ones and discuss the real-world mechanisms and practical implications behind them, rather than just memorizing options.
Good idea. Starting with the early ones about Mao Zedong thought itself. Questions like the mass line, from the masses to the masses, and surrounding the cities from the countryside. In practice, how did these actually function on the ground during the revolutionary period?
The mass line was never just a slogan. It was a concrete method of work. Cadres would go down to villages, live with peasants, listen to their complaints about landlords or taxes, then synthesize those real demands into policies. Test the policies in small areas, and only after feedback loop back to wider implementation. This trial and error cycle helped the Red Army gain deep support in rural base areas, especially during the Jiangxi Soviet and later in Yan'an.
Exactly. And the surround the cities from the countryside strategy emerged because China lacked a strong urban proletariat. Mao realized the revolution had to rely on peasant guerrilla forces controlling vast rural territories, gradually cutting off cities economically and militarily. The protracted people's war mechanism, luring the enemy in deep, preserving strength, then annihilating isolated units, was brutally practical under conditions of extreme material weakness.
Several questions cover the new democracy period and the main contradiction being the Chinese nation versus imperialism. In practice, that meant building the broadest united front possible, even including national bourgeoisie and patriotic landlords, while keeping working-class leadership. The coalition government idea on coalition government was a tactical mechanism to isolate Japanese invaders and their puppets during the anti-Japanese war.
Yes, and after 1949 the focus shifted. The 10 Major Relationships speech in 1956 is a great pivot point in these questions. Mao was trying to figure out how to handle contradictions among the people now that the main external contradiction had changed. Practically, it meant lighter handling of intellectuals, balancing heavy industry with agriculture and light industry, and avoiding over-centralization. Lessons drawn directly from the Soviet model's problems, he observed.
But many of those relationships became imbalanced again during the Great Leap Forward and the People's Communes, which several questions mention under the Kita, 3 red banners. The mechanism there was mass mobilization on an unprecedented scale. Backyard furnaces, deep plowing, exaggerated production quotas. But it lacked solid investigation and realistic feedback loops, leading to disaster.
Right. That contrasts sharply with Deng Xiaoping's approach later. Questions about the household contract responsibility system, the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee, and the socialist market economy at the 14th Congress show a return to seeking truth from facts through actual results. Allowing peasants to keep output after fulfilling quotas immediately boosted grain production because it aligned incentives with labor effort. Very pragmatic.
The primary stage of socialism theory, systematically explained at the 13th Congress, gave theoretical justification for that long pragmatic phase. It acknowledged low productive forces and allowed market mechanisms, private capital, and opening up without abandoning public ownership dominance. The 4 cardinal principles were kept as political guardrails, so economic experimentation wouldn't lead to systemic challenge.
Fast forward to the questions on later developments. 3 represents Scientific Outlook on Development, Xi Jinping Thought. The 5-Sphere Integrated Plan and 4-Pronged Comprehensive Strategy are essentially operational frameworks. They try to manage economic growth alongside social stability, rule of law, party discipline, and ecological limits simultaneously. Very complex governance mechanisms in a huge, uneven country.
And Xi-era concepts like the Chinese Dream, New Normal, Belt and Road, Community with a Shared Future for Mankind, and Chinese Path to Modernization emphasize both domestic rebalancing, from quantity to quality, from investment to consumption and innovation, and international positioning. The 2 safeguards mechanism is about tightening political discipline and centralized leadership to ensure policy execution across such a vast system.
One thing that stands out across almost all questions is the recurring emphasis on adapting Marxism to concrete Chinese conditions. Whether Mao's sinification in the 1930s to 40s, or every generation since. The practical test has always been whether a policy increases production, improves people's livelihood, and strengthens the party's leadership position.
Agreed. These 50 questions together map out a continuous thread. How to carry out revolution and construction in a semi-colonial, agrarian society, then in a developing socialist state, and now in a major country pursuing national rejuvenation. Each stage required new mechanisms while preserving core principles like party leadership, mass line, and seeking truth from facts.
Well summarized. The exam clearly wants students to grasp not just dates and names, but how these ideas were applied in real struggles and reforms. That's the real value of the course.
Building on what we just said, let's look at some of the later questions that test understanding of continuity and change. For example, the one about the PIAM, two centenary goals, and how they connect back to earlier modernization efforts. How do you see the practical linkage between Zhou Enlai's four modernizations in the 1960s and the current Chinese path to modernization?
It's a straight line, with necessary adaptations. Zhou's original four modernizations, industry, agriculture, national defense, science, and technology, were about catching up after decades of war and isolation. Mao supported the idea, but prioritized self-reliance and class struggle. By the time Deng picked it up again in 1978, the mechanism shifted. Instead of mass campaigns, it became targeted economic reforms, special economic zones, foreign capital, and technology imports. The practical engine became household contracting in agriculture and township village enterprises in rural industry. Bottom-up vitality combined with top-down guidance.
And by the 18th and 19th Congresses, that evolved into the MA, five-sphere integrated plan, and then the full Chinese path to modernization at the 20th Congress. The mechanism now includes common prosperity as a goal, ecological civilization as a hard constraint, and high-quality development instead of high-speed growth. It's no longer just about GDP tonnage. It's about balancing income distribution, reducing regional gaps, and controlling carbon emissions while still growing.
Precisely. Look at the question on the new normal. Xi first used it around 2014 to describe slower but more sustainable growth, structural rebalancing, and moving away from debt-fueled investment. In practice, that meant supply-side structural reform, cutting excess capacity in steel and coal, deleveraging local governments, and pushing innovation-driven development. The mechanism was using targeted macro policies rather than blanket stimulus.
Several questions touch on party-building mechanisms, like the MENA, two safeguards, and strengthening political construction. In real governance, these translate into very concrete disciplinary tools, central inspection teams, anti-corruption campaigns that removed both tigers and cows, flies, and stricter ideological training. The idea is to ensure that policies decided at the center are actually carried out at every level in such a huge country, avoiding the last kilometer problem.
Yes, and that connects back to Mao's mass line and rectification movements. The Yan rectification opposed subjectivism, sectarianism, and stereotyped writing, very similar to today's emphasis on opposing formalism and bureaucratism. The mechanism has always been periodic self-criticism and education campaigns within the party, to keep it aligned with reality and the people.
The questions on Xi Jinping thought also highlight international dimensions. The Belt and Road Initiative, community with a shared future for mankind, major country diplomacy. Practically, BRI started as a way to export excess infrastructure capacity and secure supply chains. But it evolved into a platform for connectivity, trade standards, and soft power projection. The shared future concept tries to offer an alternative discourse to Western liberal order, emphasizing win-win cooperation and non-interference.
True, but it also requires domestic mechanisms to support its strong state capacity, financial tools like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and party leadership over foreign-related work. The question about major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics captures that shift from keeping a low profile to striving for greater global contribution while still avoiding direct confrontation.
One last cluster worth mentioning, the philosophical foundations in questions about, on contradiction, and, on practice. Mao's core insight was that contradictions are universal, but their concrete forms are particular, so policy must investigate specific conditions. That principle underpins everything, from land reform tactics in the 1940s, to adjusting the Great Leap Forward when it failed, to opening special economic zones while keeping the rest of the economy planned.
Absolutely. The entire course, and these 50 questions, really test whether students understand that Marxism-Leninism in China has never been dogmatic application of texts, but a living, adaptive guide to action. The mechanism is always dialectical. Assess the principal contradiction in society at each stage, mobilize the appropriate forces, experiment boldly, sum up experience, and adjust. That's why the guiding ideology keeps developing. Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, 3 represents, scientific outlook, Xi Jinping thought, each responding to new practical needs.
Well put. If a student can explain the practical mechanisms behind each of these questions, not just recite the correct option, they've really grasped the essence of the course.
Agreed. It's less about memorizing history and more about understanding how revolutionary and governing logic actually operates in China over nearly a century. Great discussion.
Let's zoom in on a few more specific mechanisms that appear across multiple questions. The interplay between class struggle and production struggle, for instance. Several questions touch on periods when the emphasis shifted dramatically, like from the new democratic stage to socialist construction, then to the theory of continuing the revolution. How did that play out practically in policy and society?
In the early 1950s, the mechanism was relatively clear. First, complete the democratic tasks: land reform, suppressing counter-revolutionaries, marriage law. Then move to socialist transformation of agriculture, handicrafts, and capitalist industry through cooperatives and joint state-private enterprises. The practical method was gradual, paid, and voluntary in principle, though pressure was applied. The goal was to rapidly expand the state sector while keeping production going.
But by the late 1950s, especially after the anti-rightist campaign, Mao began to see remnants of capitalism and bourgeois ideology as a bigger threat, even after ownership transformation. That led to the uninterrupted revolution idea and then the full theory during the Cultural Revolution. The mechanism shifted to mass criticism, big character posters, sending intellectuals and cadres to the countryside, and establishing revolutionary committees. It aimed to prevent bureaucratic ossification and restore revolutionary spirit, but in practice it often paralyzed administration, disrupted education and production, and created deep social divisions.
Exactly. The post-1978 turn under Deng reversed that logic. The third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee declared that large-scale class struggle was basically over, and the central task was socialist modernization. Practically, that meant depoliticizing many daily issues, rehabilitating victims of previous campaigns, emphasizing expertise over redness, and judging everything by the 3 favorables, whether it promotes productive forces, national strength, and people's living standards.
That pragmatic reorientation is visible in questions about household responsibility, township enterprises, and the socialist market economy. The genius of the household contract system wasn't ideological purity. It was extremely simple. Let farmers decide what to plant after meeting the state quota, keep the surplus, and sell it freely. Production incentives skyrocketed almost immediately in pilot areas like Shaogang Village in Anhui. It was classic seeking truth from facts in action.
And the same logic applied to opening up. Special economic zones like Shenzhen weren't about abandoning socialism. They were experimental enclaves where capitalist methods, foreign investment, market pricing, labor flexibility, could be tested under tight party control. Success there provided evidence to expand the model nationwide. The 14th Congress, formalizing the socialist market economy, was really codifying what had already proven effective on the ground.
Moving to more recent questions, the common prosperity emphasis under Xi Jinping feels like a return to some earlier egalitarian impulses but with very different tools. No return to people's communes or forced equalization. Instead, it's progressive taxation, rural revitalization programs, cracking down on monopolistic capital, regulating platform economies, and expanding social security. The mechanism is regulatory and redistributive, rather than revolutionary upheaval.
Yes, and it's paired with high-quality development and innovation as drivers of growth. Questions mentioning the new development philosophy, innovation, coordination, green, open, shared, show an attempt to correct imbalances created during the high-speed growth era. Regional disparities, environmental damage, over-reliance on exports and investment. The practical levers are industrial policy favoring advanced manufacturing, carbon peaking/neutrality targets, and the dual circulation strategy, domestic market as mainstay with international circulation as complement.
Across all these shifts, from Mao's rural encirclement to Deng's opening to Xi's new era, the constant mechanism is dialectical materialism applied to China's specific national conditions. Identify the principal contradiction, determine the main task, choose appropriate forms of struggle and construction, experiment, summarize, institutionalize successes, correct mistakes. That adaptive cycle is what ties every question together.
Spot on. Whether it's the mass line in base areas, rectification campaigns, reform pilots, supply-side reforms, or centralized leadership in the new era, the underlying method is always to stay close to reality, mobilize the people where needed, and adjust based on concrete results. That's the thread that runs through nearly a century of CPC history and makes these 50 questions more than trivia. They're a map of how theory meets practice in governing 1/5 of humanity.
Couldn't agree more. This dialogue has really helped clarify how interconnected these concepts are when viewed through their practical application rather than isolated events or dates.
Same here. It's a rich field, precisely because it's so dynamic and responsive to changing conditions. Great talking this through.
Another fascinating thread running through many of these questions is the evolution of United Front work. From the new democratic revolution's broadest possible alliance against imperialism and feudalism, to handling non-public ownership sectors after 1949, and then to the three represents, allowing advanced productive forces, including private entrepreneurs, into the party. How has the practical mechanism of United Front changed over time?
In the revolutionary period, the United Front was a strategic necessity. During the anti-Japanese War, the Second United Front with the Kuomintang was maintained despite deep mistrust, through liaison offices, joint declarations, and shared anti-Japanese propaganda, while the CPC preserved its independence and expanded base areas. The mechanism was unity and struggle, cooperate where possible, criticize and expose where necessary, always keeping armed forces and political initiative in CPC hands.
Post-liberation, the United Front shifted to long-term coexistence and mutual supervision with the democratic parties and non-party personages. Practically, that meant giving them consultative roles in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, CPPCC, reserving seats in the National People's Congress, and involving them in policy discussion, while the CPC retained ultimate leadership. It was a mechanism to absorb intellectuals, former industrialists, and ethnic/religious leaders into the socialist order without alienating them.
The big shift came with three represents in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Jiang Zemin argued that private entrepreneurs and technical professionals who met certain conditions could join the party. The practical effect was to legitimize the growing private sector, reduce ideological tension with the new rich, and bring their talent and capital under party influence rather than letting them form an independent political force. It was a major adaptation to the reality that non-public economy had become a key growth driver.
In the Xi era, United Front work has become more institutionalized and expansive. Questions indirectly touch on this through party leadership and the Komaya, two safeguards. The mechanism now includes stronger oversight of religious affairs, ethnic work, overseas Chinese affairs, and Hong Kong/Taiwan/Macau issues. The United Front Work Department has been elevated, with more resources and clearer directives to build consensus around national rejuvenation and to counter separatism or foreign influence.
Yes, and all of this still operates under the old principle of seeking common ground while reserving differences. The CPC seeks broad alliances on development, stability, and sovereignty, but draws hard lines on core issues like One China principle or party leadership. It's a very pragmatic balancing act. Maximize support, minimize opposition, channel diverse interests toward national goals.
We should also touch on the questions related to ideological work and cultural confidence. From Mao's Let 100 Flowers Blossom, which started as encouragement but turned into the anti-rightist campaign, to Xi's emphasis on cultural confidence and socialist core values. The practical mechanism has always involved controlling the narrative while allowing some space for creativity and debate.
In the 1956-57 100 Flowers period, the intention was to encourage criticism of bureaucracy and help correct errors after collectivization. But when criticism went too far, the mechanism flipped to identifying and isolating rightists. Later, the Cultural Revolution used mass ideological mobilization on a huge scale, Red Guards, struggle sessions, revolutionary operas, to reshape culture and consciousness. Both showed the difficulty of managing open discourse in a highly politicized environment.
Today the approach is more sophisticated. Promote core socialist values through education, media, public campaigns, and party schools. Build a strong online presence. Support domestic cultural industries, films, games, literature, that align with national pride, while strictly managing content deemed to challenge political fundamentals. The mechanism combines positive guidance, censorship where necessary, and harnessing market forces for soft power projection.
Looking at all these examples, from United Front tactics to ideological mechanisms to economic reform pilots, the 50 questions collectively illustrate one central idea. The CPC treats theory as a guide to action, not a fixed dogma. Every major policy turn is justified by concrete analysis of changing conditions, tested in practice, and then elevated to guiding thought once proven effective. That's why the course title pairs Mao Zedong thought with socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's one continuous tradition of adaptation.
Exactly. Whether students can explain the why and how behind each question, rather than just the what or when, determines whether they've truly understood the material. This has been an excellent deep dive.
Agreed. These conversations really bring out the living, practical character of the subject. Until next time.